President Biden held a wide-ranging press conference on Wednesday afternoon. The White House has faced criticism for lack of access to the president. The press conference comes as the latest Political Morning Consult poll offers new insight on Americans' feelings about the administration. 68% of voters say the country is on the wrong track, with just 40% of voters approving of the job President Biden is doing. And only 43% say the president is capable of leading the country. Despite those numbers, President Biden tried to set an optimistic tone, stressing that even with hurdles in the Senate, he still believes he can get parts of his agenda accomplished.
Look, I didn't overpromise, but I think if you take a look at what we've been able to do, you'd have to acknowledge we made enormous progress. I'm confident we can get pieces, big chunks of the Build Back Better law signed into law. I predict to you they'll get something done on the electoral reform side of this.
For more, I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Hi there, Ed. The president's aides billed this press conference as a reset. And the thing that stood out to me at the outset here is just the sheer length of it, almost 2 hours long. What stood out to you?
Start in the domestic space first. Spent a lot of time touting the accomplishments of the past year, getting trillions of dollars of federal aid passed, the record low unemployment rate and the job growth that came with it, the push to get hundreds of millions of people vaccinated, and other domestic achievements, but a touch of humility from the president right at the beginning, saying he understands that the federal testing program that is now underway to deal with COVID-19 could have probably been set up faster. And he acknowledged that that was a misstep by his administration, at least in recent months. Also acknowledging that there is likely to be some kind of military conflict between Ukraine and Russia in the coming weeks. To what extent it will occur is unclear. He signaled that he can understand Russian President Vladimir Putin's concerns about a force structure in the European portions of Russia. In plain English, what he's saying there is, I can appreciate that the Russian leader is a little intimidated by the fact that the United States, NATO, and Ukraine have a bunch of military assets and personnel just on the other side of the Russian border. Let's have a conversation about that. But he pointed out that in diplomatic talks that are continuing this week in Europe, the Russians haven't brought up that subject specifically. And if he decides to engage Ukraine, invade parts of it, there will be crushing economic sanctions that he doesn't want to detail quite yet until they see the extent of the invasion. Beyond that, you heard him repeatedly now throughout the news conference talk about what is it exactly that Republicans are going to be campaigning on to do in this election year. As he said at one point to our Nancy Cortez, what's Mitch for? Referring to the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who today said that the midterm elections are going to be essentially a report card on the president's actions on inflation, dealing with COVID, and other situations. And the president said, sure, and I think we're going to do okay on that, because what is it exactly that Republicans want to do besides obstruct and block his attempts to get legislation passed? But he also acknowledged that he's having some struggles within his own party, keeping everyone in line and in agreement on specifically the Build Back Better plan. He acknowledged repeatedly it is likely to come apart in the coming weeks, and there will be attempts to pass the more popular elements of it in smaller, more modest legislation. That is something that Democrats have been calling on him to do. Elizabeth Warren did it, for example, yesterday on CBS, saying that perhaps it's time to consider that. What exactly would it be besides climate change? Potentially the child tax credit that expired at the end of the year. Maybe some other elements of the plan that are in there regarding affordable housing or childhood health care. Some elements regarding education. We'll see. But they'll face the same rules challenges in the Senate that they're facing tonight as the Senate prepares to reject his voting reform legislation. And as he was speaking, Senator Joe Manchin, that key moderate who's been a thorn in the president's side throughout the past year, reiterated on the floor of the Senate during the news conference his opposition to changing Senate rules, which means the voting reform legislation is going down in defeat later tonight because it won't be able to pass without 60 votes. That led to another series of interesting answers by the president. The fact that he said, when asked at least twice, can you consider the results of November's elections as legitimate if your legislation is not passed? He didn't say yes. He suggested that there is the potential in some parts of the country for a repeat of what we saw after the 2020 elections, or worse. And it's just telling that we've now seen two presidents in succession not be able to say yes to the question of will you be able to accept the results of the election. And it just shows you, I think, it's kind of the troubles that this democracy continues to face. So lots to unpack in a nearly 2-hour exchange. The White House warned it could get loquacious. It certainly did. And this will certainly go a far way, this West Wing would believe, in rebutting the claims that this president doesn't spend enough time with the news media.
So, Ed, let me ask you about what appears to be a kind of disconnect here. When you look at public approval and support for the president's policies that have to do with those issues that you just mentioned, there is public support for those elements. But at the same time, we have seen when it comes to the president's own approval numbers, those numbers have sagged. What did the president say about this apparent disconnect when you look at, again, those individual components that we have seen in polling time and time again actually do enjoy majority of public support?
Yeah, well, what he said repeatedly throughout is he's got to do a better job of explaining and defending what he has done. And that part of that is that he's been trapped here at the White House or at Camp David or at his home in Delaware because he does get out of this place. He goes to Delaware and he goes to Camp David virtually every weekend. But he hasn't been able to travel the country the way he would have liked to meet with Americans, to explain what he's been up to try to draw the contrast with Republicans. And he said, I will be doing that over the course of this year to better explain things, to campaign for fellow Democrats, to raise money for them. And he believes by getting out there and doing that and sort of reminding people maybe why it is they wanted him in this position in the first place, why they like the guy. And our polling continues to show people personally like him. They're just frustrated with how he's doing overall in the job, that he believes that will help improve their performance. But it's also striking, frankly, to hear him say that, look, if you look at these things on paper, or if you look at these things in terms of sheer logistics and the fact that things have been set up so quickly, we're doing okay on testing. The schools are mostly open. The science is what's driving the annoying drag on so many young families in this country that their unvaccinated children are not yet protected by a shot or two. And in those moments, it seemed to me, there was some incredible disconnect between the reality that so many Americans are facing and what he is seeing in terms of results every day in his meetings and briefings and what he's hearing from his aides and his medical experts. And that is why he says he needs to get out there more often. And, based on some of his answers to those questions and what we hear from voters and what we see in our polling, he's probably right. He needs to go see some of that and hear it from Americans.
Ed, I want to ask you a little bit more on that. But first, let's go ahead and play the president's response to the Biden administration's response to testing. Let's listen to that.
Should we have done more testing earlier? Yes. But we're doing more now. We've gone from 0 at-home tests a year ago to 375 million tests on the market in just this month. The COVID-19 is not going to give up and accept things. It's not going to go away immediately. But I'm not going to give up and accept things as they are now.
So, Ed, tell us a bit more about what else he discussed regarding that. He also mentioned the Supreme Court.
Yeah, what he was asked, for example, is he going to push ahead with plans to possibly require vaccination in order to fly domestically? He didn't answer that directly. Said he disagreed with the court's decision and made clear that, now that this new online testing site is available and that tests are, available at mass vaccination sites across the country, that masks are being distributed, the government is doing what it can to address this. Might have not happened fast enough, might not be sufficient, but it is helping drive down the death rate and control the infection rate, or at least not make it as bad as it could be for those who may not have their shots. But again, and he said repeatedly, I get the frustration. I understand that people are upset about COVID-19 and how it's dragging down all aspects of society. But whether that's going to be enough, to make that sort of I feel your pain argument at a time when people really are feeling it in all sorts of ways, I think will be reflected in the coming days and weeks, depending on how he bounces out of this news conference, depending on how they change the subject here at the White House away from voting rights, which is a base motivating exercise that's going to fail tonight, and as they try to shift attention back to discussions about how to get elements of that big social spending plan passed in the coming weeks. Right now there's a goal, a loose goal, they haven't said it out loud and formally, but there's a hope that some of this may be passed or on its way to passage by March 1st, when the president is set to give what would be the latest in a calendar year formal State of the Union address to Congress.
All right, Ed O'Keefe at the White House. Ed, thank you very much.